I'm Kylie Watson. This is my PowerPoint on fire resistance ratings and construction. So the IBC classifies every building into 5 categories, first into 5 broad categories, and then this is based on the fire resistance of the materials. Then they are subdivided into 2 smaller categories, and those are the A and B categories. The A category involves protected construction, and the B category is less protected. And so there's type 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 construction. These all have the A and B subcategories within them, except for type 4, which has its own category, known as HT or heavy timber. The 5 different construction types are put in order from the highest fire rating, starting with 1A, 1B, all the way down to 5B. So type 1A has the best fire resistance, and then 5B would be the worst. So when you divide the 2 different types of construction in terms of fire resistance, non-combustible and combustible materials play a key role in this. And non-combustible materials are defined as materials that won't ignite or burn when subjected to fire, and then combustible materials do the exact opposite, whereas when they are subjected to fire, they can ignite and burn. Since type 1A and 2B construction have the highest rating, it requires passive protection for all elements of the structure, and then type 1B is very similar to 1A, except for the fact that you're allowed 1 hour less for the fire resistance rating for things like the bearing walls and then the structural frame, and then a half hour less for the roof. And then 2B allows for even more leniency. So as you can see, the A categories will have stricter rules than the B, and then as you work your way down in numbers, they just keep getting less restricted. And then type 3 construction allows the use for both combustible and non-combustible materials and requires non-combustible exterior walls, but they can have combustible interior walls. Type 3 construction buildings were started for buildings that are very close together, like you would see in the cities, so that when they do catch fire, or I guess if they catch on fire, their exterior non-combustible walls prevent that fire from spreading to the next building. And then type 4 buildings, also known as mill construction or heavy timber, are also known for holding up well during fires because the heavy timber structural members don't begin to burn or char until about 400 degrees. And once they do start to char, it actually retards further destruction of the wood. And you would typically see this in manufacturing and storage buildings. And then type 5 construction has the least amount of fire resistance restrictions and basically allows any materials allowed within code. Most common is like light wood framed family houses. And since this type has the lowest fire restrictions, they often use fire resistance rated materials on the buildings to protect it. For applicable IBC codes, to find information on the fire resistance ratings on buildings, you can go to section 703, which is fire resistance ratings and fire tests, and that has most of the general fire resistance ratings information. And then there's also some good information in 704, which is fire resistance ratings of structural members. So it's a little more specific, but it still has some pretty good information in it. And then here's more specific information on those IBC codes. 704.13.2, which is fire resistance rating, is application of the sprayed fire resistant material, or SFRM, is consistent with the fire resistance rating, minimum thickness, dry density, and then method of application and condition of the substrate surface before you apply it. 703.2.4 is supplemental features, and it says pretty much any other materials or devices that aren't a part of the fire resistance rated materials have to be tested so that they don't affect or bring down the fire resistance materials effectiveness required for the building. And then lastly, 703.5.1 is elementary materials, and it basically says materials that need to be classified as non-combustible, they have to be tested and meet the requirements of ASTM E136. And these codes all have to do with fire resistance ratings because they all have to comply with the ratings themselves or create a fire resistance for the building. Some good examples of code use would be for 703.2.4, using bricks on the exterior of a type 5 house where there is little to no fire resistance restrictions. And this is good because it doesn't bring down the fire resistance, and it actually kind of helps it, because bricks are like the best fire resistant materials out there, or I guess one of them, because they're non-combustible. And this could also be applied to code 703.51, because these codes are very similar, and like I said before, the bricks are non-combustible, so they meet requirements for both codes. A good example for code 704.13.2 would be applying a sprayed fire-resistant material to a clean substrate when the temperature is consistently above 40 degrees for the sprayed fire-resistant material to dry properly. Bad examples of code use. A bad example of code 703.2.4 would be using real wood floors in a large building where there are higher fire restrictions. And this is bad because wood is considered one of the easiest things to burn, and they could just use a concrete floor. But that's kind of an extreme example. A bad example of 704.13.2 would be applying an extra layer of the sprayed fire-resistant material to cover cracks and add extra protection. And this wouldn't work because the sprayed fire-resistant material isn't allowed to have cracks by code, and you can't add a whole bunch of layers because it has to be a certain thickness, and it's usually thinner. A horrible example of code 703.5.1 would be if someone wanted to use a material that needed to be tested as non-combustible, and they just tested it themselves by lighting a match to see if it burns. And this is a bad example because, one, there are certain tests that have to be completed, and they aren't done by just anybody anywhere they want. But like I said, the example for 703, both 703 codes were kind of extreme because they were harder to find bad examples for. Critical overview of codes. All of these codes are pretty important to fire resistance, ratings, and construction. Code 704.13.2 makes sure that the sprayed fire-resistant material is applied correctly and stays effective at resisting fire on substrates. Code 703.2.4 makes sure that the materials that aren't required in fire resistance don't decrease the effectiveness of the materials that are required. And code 703.5.1 makes sure that the materials that need to be non-combustible are tested and approved instead of just kind of assuming they are. And all of these codes make a safer environment, but also help to protect other buildings around them, and can even save the owners money because it helps preserve the building from the fires if they do occur. Critical overview. I really have no complaints about these codes, just because they are pretty simple and they protect the building. But if I did have to come up with something like saying these codes shouldn't be in place because they add too much money or add to the cost of things, and then they make things take longer, and then it makes things overly complicated than if these codes weren't in place. But that's not very realistic because I think that these codes are pretty reasonable. But that was just if I had to come up with some. Overall, I think fire resistance rated construction helps more than it hurts by far. Like I said before, I really don't think that these codes or fire resistance construction hurts anybody. Fires can be very dangerous and destructive, so having it in place helps protect the money that you put into it, as well as the building itself, and the buildings surrounding that building, and then the people that go into the building. And that is it. Here are my references.